Hi everyone, I'm Alessandro Carollo from the Department of Psychology and Cognitive Science at the University of Trento. I'm here today because in the past months, together with our team, we have investigated the impact of time spent in lockdown on several aspects of our lives, such as our beliefs, our physical activity, our perceptions, our affections, and so on. So by using a machine learning approach followed by a statistical analysis, we have found some unexpected results of the time on perceived loneliness. As a matter of fact, there was no evidence in the literature guiding us on understanding and predicting the way in which people would be affected by COVID-19 pandemic and the time spent in lockdown. Although some studies conducted on past epidemics reported increased rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, and substance abuse symptoms in the affected populations. Additionally, social isolation in the existing literature is also considered a risk factor for mental and physical health, mortality, and cognitive decline. So even with this available knowledge, there still was a gap in the literature about the influence of time in social isolation during a pandemic. So for this existing gap, we decided to investigate the role of time spent in lockdown on modulating the effects of lockdown restrictions. And in order to answer to our research question, we divided our study in two parts. First, we wanted to understand the aspect that is more sensitive to time. In other words, we wanted to understand which part of our physical and mental life was affected the most by the time in lockdown. And second, we aimed to understand how the most sensitive aspect was modulated by the time. So without any available literature to guide our hypothesis, we adopted a data-driven machine learning approach in order to extract the variable that is more sensitive to time. Consequently, we looked at the most sensitive aspect and we conducted a statistical analysis to assess the significance of the passage of time on it. So the dataset that we used for this study was derived from an online survey conducted by the Global COVID study team that investigated participants' physical and mental health during the pandemic that we are currently experiencing. So for example, some aspects that were explored with the survey were the quality of sleep, paranoid traits, schizotypal traits, depression symptoms, and so on. So in total, as we can see here, this survey consisted of 359 questions and over 13,000 participants from more than 60 countries completed it. As we can see from the map, the number of survey completions weren't equally distributed around the world. In fact, they were concentrated in some areas, some countries, such as the United Kingdom, Greece, the USA, and Italy. From this original dataset, we selected 10 aggregated scores that we can find here on the table, and that we believe to be highly representative of participants' physical activity, mental health, cognitions, affections, and living environment. So for each participant, we computed the number of weeks they spent in lockdown at the time of the survey completion. So this allowed us to somehow normalize the data from all the participants and to be able to compare them. Subsequently, based on their sample size and the similarity in the time period that was covered, two countries were selected for being tested. So the UK sample was used for both the machine learning part and the statistical part of the study, whereas the sample from Greece was used uniquely for the statistical validation of the results. In the table here, I've reported the distribution of participants grouped by the number of weeks they spent in lockdown, always at the time of survey completion. And specifically, as I highlighted here in red, we focused our attention on data from participants who took part in the survey during week 3 to 6 of their lockdown. So as previously mentioned, the study consisted of two parts. The first one, in green, in which we aimed to discover the aspect that was affected the most by the time in lockdown. And the second one, in blue, in which we aim to statistically characterize the distribution of this aspect. So for the first part, we used a machine learning approach in which the dataset was divided into a trained set that was used to train the model and a test set that was used to evaluate the model. Weeks into lockdown and aggregated variables were used for training a random forest model to predict the week in which the week in lockdown starting from the aggregated variables. Also, the optimal parameters were calibrated by using a methodology that we derived from biomarker discoveries and that allowed us to avoid overfitting and other biases. So the model performances on train and test sets were evaluated using the mean squared error, and also the importance of the variables in order, let's say, in other words, their usefulness on the training process was obtained through a ranking. So we can say that the most important variable is the one that had the highest weight on influencing the model's training, and for this reason, we can consider it as the aspect that was influenced the most by the time in lockdown. So therefore, we subsequently studied it through a statistical approach in which a Kruskal-Wallis test was conducted on all groups of weeks in order to understand if there was at least a significant difference between a pair of them. So if the result was significant, post-hoc comparisons were computed always by using the Kruskal-Wallis test, but this time to compare week 3 to the others. So in this slide, there are the results of the first part of the study, the one in which we tried to uncover the most affected aspect by the time in lockdown. So the final performances of the model were 0.587 on train and 0.892 on test. This means that on average, the model's predictions were wrong for the value of half a week on train, so 60%, and for the value of about 1 week on test, 90%. Also, at the end, perceived loneliness was the most important variable for the model and was therefore considered the aspect that was most influenced by the time in lockdown. So by visualizing the scores of perceived loneliness on a bar plot, we can see here that a curious and unexpected U-shaped curve emerged, telling us that the level of loneliness decreased for the first few weeks of lockdown. So at this point, we had to investigate through the second part of the study if this distribution of scores was significant or not. And it was for both the UK and Greece. So as we can see here from the second row of the table, both the multi-pair comparisons were significant. And also from post-hoc comparison tests, week 3 was significantly different from week 4 and 5 in the UK sample and from week 5 in the Greek sample. So therefore, perceived loneliness emerged to be the most important variable, and a counterintuitive pattern, in particular a U-shaped curve for its score emerged. So this was surprising at first, but looking carefully at the existing literature, there could be some explanations about this fact. So in fact, loneliness is a different construct than social isolation. For the former is a more subjective evaluation, while the latter is a more objective fact. So from this perspective, loneliness is the result of the mismatch between desired support and the support offered from the environment. The specific reason of this reduced mismatch for the first weeks of lockdown is still to be clarified, but we can hypothesize that we may have had a better social support that was likely to be triggered by the common situation of danger that we were living, or another one. Otherwise, we may have had more appreciation about the social support that we have always received. So with this final slide, I want to thank you all for listening, and because my presentation is now finished, and I would like to thank here all the people from the Global COVID Study team and all the participants that with their help made this study possible. Thank you.